We should never see the process of overshadowing as being one which is confined merely to the human kingdom. That it is a factor in human evolution is certain. There is hardly a mythology that does not draw attention to the factor of muses, of overshadowing entities who contribute to the illuminated progress of a race, who contribute to the poetry and art in general, even to the sciences and to the philosophies. But to understand overshadowing in the human kingdom, we must use the usual occult technique of looking into the microcosm in order to understand man, or viewing the macrocosm in order to understand man. For man is a microcosm of the universe, and the atom and molecules are microcosms of man. Man being a solar system in miniature. That is the usual occult technique. So we, at the outset of our subject today, which is one which attempts to go beyond the surface of things. In our Sunday classes we try and go beyond or below the surface of things, go beyond ordinary teachings. So we need to understand as much of overshadowing as we can from evidence available. We know that a seed in itself possesses an etheric body. The etheric body is minute. It is hardly significant at all. The seed may have been dormant for 2,000 years. It may have been a wheat seed lying in a pyramid for much longer than that period. Might have been a hard tree seed that has lain dormant for 2 or 3 years. They all have a minute etheric body, which is possible to photograph. However, the moment that we introduce certain physical factors to the seed's environment, the moment that we introduce water, the moment that we introduce warmth, and the moment that we introduce oxygen, then the seed begins to swell as its skin is penetrated through its tester by water. And the immediate effect of this esoterically, this period of germination of the seed, is that the etheric body becomes tremendously enlarged. The seed is now active, and activity implies a sudden, rapid enlargement of the etheric body. And what is more, the etheric body may even display something of the shape of the flower to be, or the plant to be. We have examples of this from the photography used by the Delaware laboratories, the great camera there that was used in the 1950s and 1960s, where seeds like aconite, and if I remember, honeysuckle and others, chestnut, show an overshadowing etheric structure in an energy that was not light. The camera was photographing an energy that was not light, an energy unknown, but various laboratories, people who professionally developed the Delaware prints gave testimony that whatever was fogging the plates was not light. It was an energy other than light. And so there are straightforward points that emerge here, but to my mind, which always tries to probe deeper implications, there are several suggestions here about the overshadowing process which need a second look. Why should the etheric body become enlarged when you introduce physical factors? If you introduce water and heat and oxygen, these are physical factors, but the etheric body then begins to enlarge. It seems to suggest, to my mind, that there are two etheric structures involved. That there is an overshadowing inner etheric component which bears such matters as the archetypal pattern of the species that comes into play in the seed that's beginning to germinate, and also a completely accessory etheric force field introduced by the physical factors. The plant's material, by that I mean the seed's material, the material of its embryo, the material of its storage organ, the oxygen, the heat, and the H2O, the water. And then as the plant grows, it takes from the soil mineral salts, more water, it takes from the atmosphere carbon, it takes from the sun energy and photosynthesis. All these are physical factors. Each carbon atom has its etheric counterpart. You can study the etheric structures underlying all the atoms in occult chemistry. You can look for yourselves quite clearly. It will show you the fourth etheric of the nitrogen atom, the third etheric, the second etheric, and the first etheric. The different planes, subplanes of etheric substance that interpenetrate all matter. And so when the seed begins to germinate, it begins to accumulate as it grows more and more of the externa, atoms and molecules, begins to lay down tissues, and each of these have their own etheric counterpart which is multiplying. And yet there is an overshadowing archetypal pattern which is acting on these tissues that are growing, which proclaims throughout the life of that plant that it is of a certain species. And that archetypal pattern has its own etheric body, or etheric pattern, and the developing physical structure has its etheric pattern. And together they interact with each other. Now that is a very new advance in the field of esoteric sciences. And of course, it is in thorough keeping with age-old principles that no matter what grows, it grows partly as the result of the environment, the Earth's circumstances, the laws governing the Earth, the energies available like light, heat, and magnetism, the light of photosynthesis, the warmth of spring and summer, and it also incorporates the triggering mechanisms and guiding mechanisms of the genes and chromosomes of the physical structure. And so all these are producing an etheric force field, but not one which is completely uninhibited, so that it rushes into this direction and mushrooms into that shape and is inhibited. It is all under an overriding, superior force field, an archetypal force field, nevertheless, which reaches etheric expression. So when we think of an etheric matrix, we accept that this acts as a matrix, that these two together shape the unmolded clay of matter into form. Try and remember that when you talk about an etheric matrix, there are two aspects to it. See the human hands as being symbolic of it. Immediately my mind triggers off with the very hard to switch from one thinking cap to another, to go from biology into poetry, and to think of the potter in Omar Khayyam, who is fashioning the different pots with his two hands. And the pots speak to him and talk to him, and each shape of a pot has a different personality or character in it. And this is what the esoteric proposition is, that on our planet, man himself is the grand symbol and progenitor of all living things. It is his radiations, his presence on the planet, which provides at the extremes of this radiation the overshadowing, etheric, archetypal matrix. And that when the seed is planted, the etheric matrix of the higher order is implied, but by providing the seed with its appropriate or necessary materials, it evokes from the seed an etheric response. As the tissues begin to multiply, the ectoderm and the endoderm and the mesoderm begin to multiply, they create their own etheric force field, and the plant is the result of the interplay of these two. And it is its species, because of the overshadowing archetypal pattern, and its definitive structure, its sharpness and detail, is provided by the inherited organizing chromosomes and genes, which release their appropriate DNA, and so the plant is never lost to control. The plant is always an expression still of the universal plan for the planet. Man is the progenitor of all things. Now, when we come to the human embryo, we must take what we've learnt a little further. And we must say that in a very direct stream from man, there is created an overshadowing, I can't use the word crude, but blunt, an overshadowing, crude, non-definitive etheric matrix. We're not concerned at the moment with its astral counterpart and its mental counterpart, which we call the mental sheath, and the astral sheath. We would say then that the fertilized egg, really now 2 kingdoms up, this being the plant, animal, human, we would say that the fertilized egg at birth enacts the same scenario that we have just described in the plant, that the human embryo draws from its environment, and in this case it would be through the umbilical cord from the mother. It will draw its materials. The fact that the materials, which are still carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, nitrogen, the fact that these materials are coming out of the mother may provide the lower etheric field with characteristics, peculiarities, which carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen taken straight from the soil might not provide. Nevertheless, the fact is that with the growth of the embryo, the materials that are incorporated into it, the mineral salts, the proteins, the amino acids, the fatty acids, the glucose, and so on, that all these have their own etheric nature, and they will tend to flow into the crude, blunt, overshadowing archetypal pattern. And the embryo can only go so far inside the fetal sac. It must be born. It's inconceivable that even under monstrous scientific experimentation that a baby could be kept inside its membranes and fed appropriately for several years. It has to be born, and in being born certain other forces come into play, like gravity. Gravitational pull begins to act upon the child that is born. Exposure of the lung surfaces to air. Friction of the skin with clothing and hot water. And the eyes reacting to light. The senses reacting to pressures. All these factors come into play strongly, much more strongly than whilst the child was inside the mother. What is more, the child is now really inside and affected by the anima mundi of the earth. That is, the etheric body of the earth. The child is being inundated with auric emissions from its family, especially the mother. And the mother is contributing her emotional energy to the child, which is very necessary for growth, and far more necessary for maturation of the emotional parts of the child. All this goes on. And so, yet once more, we have a primary, underlying, blunt, etheric, archetypal matrix interacting with an exterior, secondary, overriding matrix which is in dynamic equilibrium with the environment. So the child is the interplay of these two etheric forces. Now we can understand the secret of growth of the human embryo, which begins off with a tiny egg 1/200th of an inch in diameter, barely visible to the naked eye, and by ways which science does not wholly understand, grows and grows into a 9-month fetus. We try to give explanations for this. We say the original set of chromosomes inside the first cell issue instructions, pass on their record of what the parents' genes carried, tries to shape an embryo, but we say that this is not the total process. There is within overshadowing a higher etheric matrix. Now, if we were to add up all the enzymes, if we were to add up all the hormones and the chemical processes involved in fashioning a human fetus out of a tiny fertilized egg, then the egg would have to be about several thousand times larger than it actually is to pack all the hormones and the enzymes and directing mechanisms. So we really don't know how the embryo grows. We can study it, but it is incomprehensible to us how inside this tiny egg there could be the initial controlling factors which shape a child, rather shape the child that is born. So that remains an a field of science that remains to be explored, to find out how the embryo really is directed into growth. But we have given the answer here, that every human child has an overriding blunt etheric matrix and develops through its genes and chromosomes a secondary matrix. The two interact and produce the form that we know as human. Can we observe evidence of this anywhere in our own bodies? The interaction of two matrices. Have we ever thought of what the archetypal matrix might produce on its own? It would be very like the initial pictures of embryos in their initial stages of development, 6 weeks embryo, 2 months embryo, a blunt, ugly, featureless creature. In man, adult man, imagine structures like fingers that had no nails, no elongation of bones, which were in fact very like a chubby child's hand or foot. If we took a finger, we could say, all right, the general pattern is a protrusion. The general pattern is a protrusion, and we could say this is the human archetypal form. But under the influence of the secondary etheric structure, the finger is given nails. The finger is given its nail, or the toe is given its nail. And so the crude archetypal pattern is made more specific, and the specificity of it is related, of course, to the demands of the earth environment. Otherwise it wouldn't be of any value. If you lose a toenail or a fingernail because of a cut or a blow, and the nail is lost or eventually is shed, the finger becomes round, blunt, shapeless in that place. But with the regrowth of the nail from the nail bed, and all sorts of environmental factors would have to be present, like the appropriate nutrition, the appropriate keratin from the liver, and so on. But when the nail is produced, it emerges and grows to its etheric matrix, and the interaction of the two is to give shape once more to the toe and to restore its relationship to the earth. Now these are frontier propositions, but they do help to explain anthropogenesis. It helps to explain anthropogenesis as we know it. This is a good time for anthropogenesis because the whole field of evolution is under question once more. There are many people who have been Darwinists who are now wavering. And the time really is now suitable for us to put forward the kind of material that I am leading here today. Yes, we accept that structures have evolved from the earth. Yes, we accept that the fortuitous bringing together of amino acids in the slime, in primordial slime, and possibly the injection of energy like lightning, produced the first protoplasm. And that this protoplasm, when assembled in certain ways and under certain conditions, having its own secondary etheric force field, began to produce cells. But we would say that that in itself would not have been possible. For the protoplasm, fortuitous as it was, or the accumulation of certain amino acids, this would not have been on its own able to produce life. Indeed, we can't produce life in a laboratory test tube. You might say, well, we'll see what you say about that in 20 years. In 20 years, they may produce life in a test tube, but you can be quite sure that there will be some factor allowing the admission of the higher matrix, But we do say this is what occurred, that man's cellular structure, man was now at an immensely high state still in the mental world, had not even reached the astral level. But nevertheless, his radiations were still patent on the earth, and under the influence of the higher matrix, there was formed the first cell, the first unicellular creatures. And we would agree that the bringing together of many cells produced multicellular creatures, the growth of things like hydra, the growth of sponges, and many other very primitive structures. We would agree that with Darwinian factors now taken into account, like natural selection, that these evolved. That these evolved through various species, but all the time man is coming closer and closer. He is working his way through a mental sheath-like structure into the astral world. From the astral world he begins to come down into the etheric plane. Although it has been convinced